The morning of May 29, 1944, mid-Atlantic, approximately 500 miles west of the Azores, Kapitänleutnant Detlev Krankenhagen commanded U-549 from a depth he believed meant safety, 600 feet below the surface, deeper than most Allied depth charges could reach. His Type 9 C-40 submarine had just torpedoed and sunk the American escort carrier Block Island less than an hour before sunset, and now the hunter had become the hunted. Through the hydrophones, Krankenhagen and his crew listened to the screws of American destroyer escorts searching above. The sound was methodical, persistent. They had survived this before the standard pattern of depth charge attacks that German commanders had learned to evade through 3 years of brutal experience in the Atlantic. Drop to maximum depth, go silent, wait for the attackers to lose sonar contact in the blind spot directly beneath their hulls. Make a sharp course change in those precious seconds when the escorts passed overhead and dropped their charges. Then endure the concussive blasts that might crack gauges and shatter light bulbs, but rarely penetrated the pressure hull at this depth. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Krankenhagen could not know, what no German U-boat commander fully understood in May of 1944, was that the rules of this deadly game had fundamentally changed. The destroyer escort USS Eugene E. Elmore maintained perfect sonar contact with U-549, despite the depth. Her Type 144 sonar could detect submarines at ranges up to 3,000 yards under ideal conditions, and these conditions were nearly perfect. More critically, mounted on Elmore's foredeck, sat a weapon system that German naval intelligence had only begun to catalogue, the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. At approximately 2100 hours, Lieutenant Commander G.L. Conkey ordered his first attack run. 24 projectiles launched forward in rapid succession, all discharged in under 2 seconds. Each bomb was 7 inches in diameter, weighed 65 pounds, and carried 35 pounds of Torpex explosive. They arced through the darkness and splashed into the Atlantic in a circular pattern 200 yards ahead of Elmore's bow. The projectiles sank at 23.5 feet per second. At U-549's depth of 600 feet, they would arrive in approximately half a minute. Unlike depth charges that exploded at preset depths whether they hit anything or not, these bombs only detonated on contact. The first salvo missed, sinking silently past the submarine to the ocean floor. Krankenhagen likely believed he had dodged the attack. Elmore maintained sonar contact. The destroyer escort turned for a second pass. 3 minutes to reload. Another 24 projectiles launched. 30 seconds after they entered the water, 3 underwater explosions echoed through Elmore's sonar. 3 direct hits on the pressure hull. 4 minutes later, sonar operators detected a different sound, a heavy, crushing explosion. U-549 had imploded as she sank past her crush depth, killing all 55 men aboard instantly. From the moment Elmore fired her second salvo to the submarine's destruction, approximately 4.5 minutes. This engagement represented something German U-boat commanders were only beginning to comprehend. In the spring of 1944, a technological shift that eliminated the tactical advantages they had relied upon since war began. The question that would haunt surviving German submariners through the final year of the war was stark and terrible. How do you survive an attack you cannot hear coming, cannot evade, and that arrives before you can maneuver? To understand the psychological impact of the Hedgehog, a weapon system on German U-boat crews requires understanding what those men believed about their chances of survival before this technology appeared. By 1943, German submariners operated under no illusions about the danger they faced. The Battle of the Atlantic had claimed thousands of their comrades, but they also possessed hard-won tactical knowledge that offered genuine hope for survival. German U-boat doctrine, refined through brutal experience since 1939, centered on exploiting the fundamental weakness of Allied anti-submarine warfare, the sonar blind spot. British ASDIC and American sonar systems transmitted sound pulses that bounced off submerged targets and returned as echoes. The technology worked reasonably well at medium ranges, allowing escort vessels to detect submarines and track their movements. But at close range, the physics of underwater sound detection created a critical vulnerability. As an escort vessel closed to attack, the time between the transmitted pulse and returning echo shortened progressively. Eventually, at ranges typically under 200 yards, the outgoing pulse and returning echo merged into what operators called an instantaneous echo. The submarine effectively vanished from sonar at precisely the moment when accurate weapon placement mattered most. This blind spot extended directly beneath the attacking ship, creating a zone where the submarine could maneuver undetected. German commanders learned to exploit this weakness with practiced precision. As the escort vessel passed overhead to drop depth charges, the submarine would execute sharp changes in direction and speed. The escort, temporarily blind, dropped its charges based on the submarine's last known position, a position that might be 50 or 100 yards from where the submarine actually maneuvered during those critical seconds. Depth charges themselves imposed further limitations that worked in the submarine's favor. The Mark VI and Mark VII depth charges used by Allied forces through 1943 sank at approximately 8 to 9 feet per second. For a submarine at 300 feet depth, not even the maximum diving depth of most U-boats, the charges required over 30 seconds to reach attack depth after entering the water. During that half-minute, while the escort remained blind and the charges slowly descended, the submarine's captain could order changes in depth, speed, and heading. The explosives in depth charges detonated at preset depths using hydrostatic fuses, regardless of whether they were near the target. This created massive underwater explosions that temporarily disrupted sonar performance for both the attacker and any other escorts in the vicinity. The turbulence and noise from these explosions could persist for 15 minutes or longer, during which time the submarine might escape entirely, running silent at a different depth and heading than the escorts expected. German submarine construction emphasized structural strength, specifically to survive depth charge attacks. The pressure hull of a Type 7C U-boat, the most common variant, could theoretically withstand pressures at depths approaching 750 feet, though captains rarely pushed their boats to absolute crush depth limits. More importantly, the hull could absorb substantial shock damage from depth charges exploding nearby without catastrophic failure. Multiple charges had to detonate within 10 to 20 feet of the hull to inflict fatal damage. Statistics validated this relative survivability. British records documented that during World War II, out of 5,174 depth charge attacks, only 85.5 resulted in confirmed U-boat kills, a success ratio of approximately 1 in 60. Many U-boats survived hundreds of depth charges during their operational careers. U-427 famously endured 678 depth charges, dropped against it in April of 1945 before finally escaping. While such extreme cases were exceptional, they reinforced the belief among German submariners that depth charge attacks, however terrifying, were survivable if the crew maintained discipline and the captain executed proper evasive tactics. This is not to suggest German U-boat crews felt invulnerable. They understood acutely that Allied anti-submarine capabilities had improved dramatically since the early war years. By 1943, convoy escorts employed increasingly sophisticated tactics. Coordinated group attacks using multiple escort vessels made evasion more difficult. Improved sonar systems with better range and resolution reduced the time submarines could maneuver undetected. The introduction of escort carriers providing air cover over convoys eliminated the surface mobility that German Wolfpack tactics required. May of 1943, Black May, as German submariners came to call it, represented a turning point. In that single month, Allied forces sank 41 U-boats, losses that exceeded the rate at which German shipyards could build replacements. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, acknowledging that the balance had shifted against Germany. Yet, even as the strategic situation deteriorated, individual U-boat commanders retained tactical options based on their understanding of Allied weapons and detection systems. They could still dive deep, exploit the sonar blind spot, and maneuver during the critical seconds when escorts were dropping depth charges. The Atlantic remained a vast space where a skilled captain might find opportunities to escape or hide. The psychological framework that sustained German U-boat crews through their missions rested on this foundation of tactical knowledge. They accepted that their work was extraordinarily dangerous by war's end. Approximately 28,000 of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats would die, a casualty rate exceeding 70%. But danger and certain death were not identical concepts. Skill mattered, experience mattered. Understanding your enemy's weapons and their limitations mattered. A competent captain who knew his boat and executed proper tactics could bring his crew home. Many had done so repeatedly. The Hedgehog anti-submarine projector entered service with British escort vessels in 1942, but its impact on German tactical calculations took time to register. Initial deployments produced disappointing results. Success rates of approximately 5% barely exceeded those achieved by depth charges. Royal Navy captains launched Hedgehog attacks so infrequently in early 1943 that the Admiralty issued a directive ordering commanders to report specifically why they had chosen not to use the weapon when engaging submerged contacts. Unlike depth charges, which always produced spectacular explosions that might convince crews they had damaged or frightened their target, Hedgehog misses were discouragingly silent. The projectiles simply sank to the ocean floor without detonating, leaving no evidence of the attack except 24 small splashes in the water. This silence eliminated the psychological satisfaction that depth charge attacks provided, even when those attacks failed to sink anything. The technical principle behind Hedgehog addressed the fundamental problems that plagued depth charge attacks, but translating that principle into operational success required time, training, and integration with improved sonar systems. The weapon consisted of 24 spigot mortars, arranged in 4 rows of 6, mounted on a steel cradle on the foredeck. The spigots were angled so projectiles would land in a circular pattern, approximately 130 feet in diameter, about 200 yards ahead of the firing ship's position. Forward firing was the crucial innovation. Unlike depth charges, which had to be dropped from the stern after the attacking ship passed over the target, Hedgehog projectiles were launched ahead, while the submarine remained detectable by sonar. This eliminated the blind time during which submarines could maneuver undetected. The captain could maintain sonar contact throughout the attack, and even adjust course to compensate if the submarine changed position between the moment of firing and the arrival of the projectiles. The contact fuses represented sophisticated engineering that had required extensive development. Each projectile had to survive the violent impact with the water surface without detonating prematurely. Once submerged, a small propeller began spinning in the water flow, arming the fuse after the projectile had descended approximately 50 feet. Upon striking a hard surface, the hull of a submarine, the fuse would trigger the 35-pound Torpex charge instantaneously. Torpex was approximately 50% more powerful than TNT, the explosive used in earlier depth charges. The rapid sink rate gave submarines almost no time to react. At 23.5 feet per second, projectiles reached 200 feet depth in under 9 seconds. For a submarine at operational depth of 300 feet, the time from water entry to arrival was approximately 13 seconds. Compared to the 30-plus seconds required for Mark VI depth charges to reach the same depth, Hedgehog cut reaction time by more than half. Most significantly, a single direct hit was typically sufficient to sink a U-boat. The contact detonation meant no water cushion existed to dissipate the explosive force. 35 pounds of Torpex exploding directly against the pressure hull would rupture it catastrophically. Even if the projectile struck the outer casing rather than the pressure hull directly, the explosive force at contact distance usually proved fatal. By late 1943 and into 1944, Allied anti-submarine forces resolved the early problems that had plagued Hedgehog deployment. Better training taught crews how to aim the weapon more effectively. The introduction of combat information centers aboard escort vessels integrated sonar data with fire control systems, allowing more accurate attacks. Most critically, improved sonar systems like the Type 144 unit aboard USS Elmore could maintain contact at closer ranges and greater depths than earlier equipment. Statistics began reflecting these improvements. By the end of the war, Hedgehog attacks achieved success rates of approximately 20%, 1 submarine sunk for every 5 attacks. In comparison, depth charges never achieved better than 1 success in 80 attacks. Out of 268 Hedgehog attacks documented by British forces, 47 resulted in confirmed submarine kills, a ratio dramatically better than conventional depth charging. The United States Navy adopted Hedgehog through reverse lend-lease in late 1942. American destroyer escorts, specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, received Hedgehog as standard equipment. These vessels, smaller than fleet destroyers but larger than corvettes, proved ideally suited to the weapon system. By 1944, Hedgehog-equipped American escorts were operating across the Atlantic and in the Pacific Theater against Japanese submarines. 11 of the last 16 U-boat sinkings achieved by U.S. Navy destroyers and destroyer escorts in World War II involved Hedgehog projectiles. USS England sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May of 1944, using Hedgehog almost exclusively, a record that demonstrated the weapon's devastating effectiveness when properly employed by a well-trained crew with good sonar integration. Yet for German U-boat commanders, understanding that such a weapon existed was not the same as understanding its implications for their survival. Intelligence reports filtered back through the Kriegsmarine describing forward-firing anti-submarine weapons that exploded on contact, but the full tactical picture how Hedgehog eliminated the blind spot, the impossibly fast sink rate, the silence of failed attacks that allowed escorts to maintain sonar contact. This knowledge came too slowly to affect German doctrine or training meaningfully. By the time German submarine command fully grasped what they faced, the war had already turned irreversibly against them. The question was no longer whether Hedgehog would impact German U-boat losses, but rather how many more submariners would die before they learned what Kapitänleutnant Krankenhagen discovered in his final moments, on May 29, 1944, that all their hard-won tactical knowledge about surviving depth charge attacks meant nothing against a weapon that removed the very assumptions on which that knowledge rested. The development of the Hedgehog weapon system began not in grand naval research laboratories, but in the makeshift offices of the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an organization whose staff earned the affectionate nickname the Wheezers and Dodgers for their unconventional approach to military engineering. Commander Charles Goodave of the Royal Navy conceived the forward-throwing mortar concept in the spring of 1940, recognizing that the fundamental problem with depth charges was not their explosive power, but their tactical deployment. The technical challenge proved formidable. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker had developed spigot mortar technology between the wars, a system where the propelling charge remained fixed in the weapon while a rod, the spigot, fitted inside a tubular tail on the projectile itself. This principle had been successfully adapted for the Blacker bombard infantry mortar and the PI-AT anti-tank weapon, adapting it for naval use. Against submarines required solving problems that had defeated earlier attempts. The Fairley mortar, tested aboard HMS Whitehall in 1941, represented the first attempt at a forward-firing anti-submarine weapon. It failed comprehensively. The projectiles used an iron nose that limited explosive payload to 20 pounds, with the fuse mounted in the tail. Range was inadequate, accuracy poor, and the explosive charge insufficient to reliably penetrate a U-boat's pressure hull, even if it struck directly. Goodave's team redesigned everything. They placed 35 pounds of Torpex explosive in each projectile, with the contact fuse mounted in the nose rather than the tail. The tubular tail provided stability during flight and descent. Critical experiments determined that projectiles with flat noses were less likely to skip or ricochet when striking the water surface at high velocity, ensuring they would sink vertically into the target area rather than scattering unpredictably. The contact fuse mechanism required extraordinary precision engineering. It had to withstand the violent shock of hitting the water at terminal velocity without premature detonation. Once submerged, A small propeller blade mounted on the nose began rotating in the water flow. After approximately 50 feet of descent achieved by calibrating the propeller's pitch and resistance, the fuse armed itself. Upon striking a solid surface harder than the ocean floor sediment, a mechanical trigger would fire the detonator instantaneously. Determining the optimal explosive charge weight involved research that bordered on espionage. German U-boat construction details remained classified, but Gudev's team discovered an Italian naval magazine that had published photographs of German submarine production. One image showed a worker standing on a U-boat's pressure hull while performing maintenance work on the outer casing deck. By carefully measuring the worker's apparent leg length in the photograph and calculating the perspective distortion, engineers estimated the vertical distance between the pressure hull and outer casing, critical information for determining whether 35 pounds of torpex would penetrate both layers. The pattern of projectile dispersal required mathematical optimization. Using a device that resembled a roulette wheel with a scale model submarine placed at various positions, engineers spent days launching miniature projectiles at the model. They recorded thousands of impacts, analyzing which projectile angles and spacing patterns provided the highest probability of hitting a submarine attempting various evasive maneuvers. The final pattern, 130 feet in diameter, with projectiles spaced approximately 18 feet apart, represented the statistical optimum for catching a submarine, even if it maneuvered during the brief seconds between projectile, launch and water impact. HMS Westcott received the prototype launcher in 1941 for sea trials. The weapon performed adequately in testing, but operational results disappointed expectations severely. No submarine kills occurred until November of 1942, despite installation aboard 100 ships. Crews reported numerous technical problems. North Atlantic weather frequently covered the launcher with spray and seawater, causing electrical firing circuit failures that resulted in incomplete salvos, with some projectiles failing to launch. In heavy seas, maintaining accurate aim proved extraordinarily difficult. The psychological dimension created perhaps the greatest obstacle. Depth charge attacks always produced massive explosions visible from the surface, great geysers of water erupting violently, regardless of whether the charges hit anything. This visual and auditory feedback provided crews with a sense of accomplishment and gave escort commanders confidence they were damaging the enemy even when intelligence later revealed the submarine escaped undamaged. Hedgehog's silence when it missed removed this psychological reinforcement entirely. 24 small splashes, followed by nothing but ocean waves, created a profound sense of futility. Royal Navy leadership responded to the disappointing results with characteristically British determination. In early 1943, an officer from the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development travelled to Londonderry, where most Atlantic escort vessels based their operations. He conducted comprehensive retraining programs, ship by ship, explaining the weapon's technical principles and, more importantly, presenting case studies of successful Hedgehog attacks that demonstrated its lethal effectiveness when properly employed. The training emphasized several critical points that crews had misunderstood. First, the silence of a missed attack was actually a tactical advantage, not a deficiency. Depth charge explosions obscured sonar returns for 15 minutes or longer, forcing escorts to reacquire the submarine from scratch. Hedgehog's silence meant continuous sonar tracking throughout multiple attack runs, dramatically increasing the probability that subsequent salvos would strike the target. Second, the circular pattern was designed specifically to account for submarine evasion during the projectile's descent time. Crews needed to aim at where the submarine was at the moment of firing, not attempt to predict its future position. Third, any explosion indicated a direct hit and almost certainly meant a kill, unlike depth charges, which might explode near a submarine without inflicting fatal damage. The transformation in Hedgehog effectiveness coincided with broader technological improvements in Allied anti-submarine warfare during late 1943 and through 1944. The introduction of combat information centers fundamentally changed how escort vessels processed tactical data and made attack decisions. Previously, the captain commanded from the bridge while sonar operators worked in a separate compartment, calling out bearing and range information that the captain had to mentally integrate with the ship's heading and speed to determine attack geometry. The Combat Information Center consolidated all tactical information in a single location. Sonar returns appeared on displays that overlaid the ship's position and heading. Radar contacts merged with sonar data, providing a comprehensive tactical picture. Most critically for Hedgehog effectiveness, the fire control system integrated directly with sonar tracking, calculating firing solutions that accounted for the submarine's depth, speed, and heading along with the attack ship's course and the projectile's ballistic trajectory. German U-boat commanders began encountering this integrated system without understanding what had changed. Kapitänleutnant Helmut Sommer commanded U-853 during a patrol off the American East Coast in May of 1945, the final weeks of the European War. British aircraft had attacked his submarine near the surface in May of 1944, but Sommer survived and brought his boat home. His second patrol would demonstrate how completely the tactical equation had shifted. On May 5, 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz transmitted orders to all U-boats, directing them to cease offensive operations. Germany's surrender was imminent. Whether Sommer received this transmission or chose to ignore it remains disputed by historians. On May 6, his submarine torpedoed and sank the American collier SS Blackpoint off Point Judith, Rhode Island, the last merchant vessel sunk by German U-boat action in American waters. The response was immediate and overwhelming. American destroyer escorts USS Atherton and USS Moberly, along with several other vessels, converged on the attack location. Lieutenant Commander Louis Iselin commanded Atherton, which made initial sonar contact with the submarine at approximately 8:30 in the evening. The hunt that followed lasted through the night and into the early morning hours of May 7th, but its outcome was never seriously in doubt once the American escorts established contact. At approximately 8:30 that evening, Atherton dropped 13 magnetic depth charges. One exploded, but the crew could not determine whether it struck the submarine or one of the numerous shipwrecks littering the shallow waters off Rhode Island. Sommer, who had succeeded his former captain after the earlier attack, maneuvered his boat through the turbulence. The submarine was detected again at approximately 11:43 that night, 4,000 yards east of its previous position, lying dead in the water with propellers silent at approximately 100 feet depth. The temperature inside U-853 would have been rising in the hot, fetid air. Light bulbs shattered by the concussive force of near-miss depth charges. Gauge faces cracked. Small leaks might have appeared in hull fittings stressed by repeated shock. The crew maintained silence, knowing that any noise might betray their position to the hunting escorts above. They had survived attacks before. Sommer understood the doctrine: wait for the escorts to lose contact in the blind spot, then maneuver during the critical seconds when depth charges descended. But the escorts maintained perfect sonar contact. At approximately 2 in the morning on May 7th, Moberly executed a Hedgehog attack run. The projectiles entered the water in their characteristic circular pattern. Most sank silently to the bottom, but 3 struck U-853's pressure hull directly. The 35-pound Torpex charges detonated on contact. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What happened next depends on where exactly those 3 projectiles struck. If they penetrated the pressure hull cleanly, the crew died instantly, as seawater under tremendous pressure flooded into the submarine's compartments with explosive force. The air pressure inside would have compressed violently, creating temperatures high enough to ignite anything combustible. Death would have come in less than a second for men near the impact points, perhaps slightly longer for those in other compartments, as the ocean claimed the entire vessel. If the projectiles struck the outer casing and ruptured ballast tanks without immediately breaching the pressure hull, Sommer and his crew endured a different horror. They would have known immediately that the submarine was mortally damaged. The boat would have begun sinking, nose or stern down depending on which tanks flooded, with the crew powerless to arrest the descent. At 100 feet depth when the attack occurred, they had perhaps 4 minutes before the submarine reached crush depth somewhere beyond 700 feet. 4 minutes of knowing exactly what was coming as the pressure hull groaned under increasing stress, small leaks becoming jets of water under impossible pressure, the boat tilting at steeper angles as it plummeted into darkness. Then the final moment, a sound described by sonar operators as a heavy crunching explosion, as the pressure hull imploded, the entire structure collapsing inward in a fraction of a second under millions of pounds of force. No one aboard U-853 survived. All 55 men died. The sinking of U-853 represented not an isolated incident, but a pattern that had been developing throughout 1944 and into 1945. Operation Teardrop in April and May of 1945 demonstrated the full integration of Allied anti-submarine capabilities against a concentrated German submarine threat. Intelligence indicated that Germany had dispatched a group of Type 9 U-boats designated Gruppe, Seawolf, toward the American East Coast, possibly armed with Von flying bombs or other advanced weapons. The threat prompted the United States Navy to organize 2 large barrier forces, specifically to intercept and destroy these submarines before they could reach American waters. The first barrier force included 20 destroyer escorts divided between northern and southern groups, each supported by an escort carrier. The second barrier force consisted of 2 more escort carriers and 22 destroyer escorts. These forces established patrol lines across the mid-Atlantic, positioned based on intelligence gathered from decrypted German naval communications. The Germans remained unaware that their Enigma codes had been comprehensively broken, continuing to transmit detailed operational orders that Allied codebreakers read almost as quickly as the intended German recipients. U-1235 became the first casualty. Just before midnight on April 15th, USS Stanton detected the submarine on radar as it attempted to transit the barrier on the surface. Stanton immediately attacked with Hedgehog, but the submarine submerged and initially escaped. Assisted by USS Frost, Stanton regained sonar contact and made 3 additional Hedgehog attacks over the following hours. The third attack at approximately midnight on April 16th sank the submarine with the loss of her entire crew of 56 men. 40 minutes later, and only 1.5 nautical miles from U-1235's last position, Frost detected another submarine on radar. This was U-880, which had apparently closed on the destroyer escorts while they prosecuted U-1235. The submarine submerged after being illuminated by searchlight and hit in the conning tower by small-caliber fire. Frost, Stanton, and USS Hughes tracked U-880 with sonar through the remainder of the night. Multiple Hedgehog attacks followed. Stanton sank the submarine at approximately 4 in the morning with no survivors from her crew of 52 men. Both submarines suffered massive explosions when struck by Hedgehog projectiles, explosions far larger than 35 pounds of Torpex should have produced. This raised fears among American commanders that the submarines were indeed carrying rockets or other advanced weapons, motivating intensified efforts to destroy the remaining U-boats before they could approach closer to American territory. Intelligence later determined that neither submarine carried such weapons. The massive secondary explosions likely resulted from the Hedgehog strikes, detonating the submarine's own torpedo warheads or compressed air flasks. USS Neil A. Scott and USS Carter sank U-518 just before midnight on April 22nd using coordinated Hedgehog attacks. No one from the crew of 55 survived. On April 24th, USS Flaherty severely damaged U-546 with a Hedgehog salvo after nearly 10 hours of continuous hunting. The submarine surfaced but sank after Flaherty and 3 other destroyer escorts fired on it with deck guns. Kapitänleutnant Paul Just and 32 crewmen survived and were taken prisoner. Some were harshly treated during interrogation as American intelligence officers attempted to determine whether the U-boats had been carrying weapons for attacks on American cities. The pattern was unmistakable to those analyzing the results. U-boats that would have survived or escaped from depth charge attacks were being destroyed rapidly once Hedgehog-equipped escorts established sonar contact. The weapon eliminated the blind spot that German tactical doctrine depended upon. The rapid sink rate gave U-boat commanders no time to execute the evasive maneuvers that had saved submarines from depth charges. The contact fuses meant that any explosion indicated a hit, and hits were almost invariably fatal. For German submarine commanders who survived their encounters and returned to base, the reports they filed painted an increasingly grim picture. The standard evasion tactics, diving deep, going silent, sharp course changes when the escort passed overhead, no longer provided reliable survival margins. Some escorts could maintain sonar contact at depths previously considered safe. Some attacks came from ahead rather than from directly overhead, arriving before the submarine could maneuver. The explosions, when they came, struck directly against the hull rather than detonating nearby and producing damage through shock waves transmitted through water. German naval intelligence struggled to compile accurate information about Hedgehog from these fragmentary reports. They understood that forward-firing anti-submarine weapons existed, and that these weapons used contact fuses. But the full tactical picture, how the weapon integrated with improved sonar systems, how the forward-firing eliminated blind time, how the rapid sink rate compressed reaction time to seconds, this comprehensive understanding came too slowly to affect German tactics or training meaningfully. By the time Kriegsmarine analysts fully grasped the implications, Germany's submarine force had been decimated beyond any possibility of recovery. The statistical record of Hedgehog effectiveness tells a story of transformation in anti-submarine warfare that German commanders could read but not counter. During World War II, British forces conducted 5,174 depth charge attacks that resulted in 85.5 confirmed submarine kills, a success ratio of approximately 1 in 60 attacks. In comparison, the Hedgehog system achieved 268 attacks, resulting in 47 kills, a ratio of approximately 1 in 5.7 attacks. By the final year of the war, that ratio improved further to approximately 1 kill for every 5 attacks, a 20-fold improvement over conventional depth charging. American forces achieved similar results once crews mastered the weapon's employment. 11 of the last 16 U-boat sinkings by United States Navy destroyers and destroyer escorts involved Hedgehog projectiles. The weapon proved equally effective in the Pacific theater against Japanese submarines. USS England's unprecedented destruction of 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days, during May of 1944, RO-105, RO-108, RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, and RO-107 demonstrated what a well-trained crew with good sonar integration could accomplish. Commander Charles Goodave's ungainly device, with its peculiar name, had evolved into the most lethal anti-submarine weapon system of the war. For German U-boat crews, the implications were devastating and personal. The casualty rates among submariners, already horrific, worsened through 1944 and into the final months of the war. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, approximately 28,000 died, a loss rate exceeding 70%. No other branch of any military service in any nation suffered comparable casualties. The introduction of Hedgehog and other improved anti-submarine technologies contributed significantly to this carnage during the war's final 18 months. The psychological dimension proved equally corrosive. German U-boat doctrine had emphasized that skill and tactical knowledge could offset Allied numerical and technological advantages. Experienced commanders who understood their boats and executed proper evasion techniques could survive and complete their missions. This belief system, while never guaranteeing survival, provided a framework that made the work psychologically sustainable. Men could convince themselves that their fate remained partially in their own hands, that competence and courage mattered. Hedgehog demolished that framework by removing the tactical variables upon which German doctrine depended. The weapon attacked from ahead while the submarine remained under continuous sonar observation, eliminating the blind spot that evasion tactics exploited. The projectiles arrived in seconds rather than the half-minute or longer that depth charges required, compressing reaction time below the threshold where human decision-making could effectively respond. The contact detonation meant a single hit was fatal, removing the graduated damage model where submarines might survive near misses and accumulate survivable damage over extended attacks. Surviving U-boat commanders reported a psychological shift among crews during the final year of the war. The grim determination that had characterized earlier periods gave way to something approaching fatalism. Men understood intellectually that they were likely sailing to their deaths. The operational statistics made this unavoidable. New submarines departing on their first patrol had survival probabilities measured in single-digit percentages. Experienced boats and crews fared only marginally better as Allied anti-submarine capabilities continued improving while German resources and training standards deteriorated. Herbert Werner, who commanded several U-boats and survived the war, described the atmosphere in his memoir Iron Coffins, a title that captured the claustrophobic horror of submarine service during this period. He wrote of men going to sea knowing they would probably not return, of silent meals before departure where submariners avoided discussing the future because acknowledging it seemed like inviting fate. He described the sounds of depth charge attacks, the waiting in darkness and silence while water dripped from stressed hull fittings, and men counted the seconds between explosions, calculating whether the pattern was moving closer or farther away. But Werner also noted that attacks which came without warning, no sound of approaching propellers, no gradual intensification of ASDIC pings were the ones that terrified crews most completely. The submarine might be running silent at depth when suddenly the hull would ring with the impact of projectiles striking directly, followed instantaneously by the catastrophic detonation that meant someone's war had just ended. No time to brace for impact, no opportunity for evasive action, no gradual build-up of tension that at least gave crews the illusion of participation in their own survival. Just sudden violence and death, or, for the fortunate few in boats that survived damaged, the knowledge that next time they might not be so lucky. The German submarine force effectively ceased to exist as a strategic threat during the final months of the war. Dönitz continued dispatching boats on patrol, partially because withdrawal would have freed Allied naval resources for other operations, partially from institutional inertia, and partially from the increasingly desperate hope that new submarine designs equipped with snorkel-breathing apparatus might restore some tactical balance. They did not. The war ended with Germany's submarine pens in France destroyed or captured, her remaining operational boats scattered across Norwegian fjords and Baltic ports, and her crews consisting largely of inadequately trained replacements for the experienced submariners who had died during 4 years of brutal attrition. The story of the Hedgehog weapon system extends beyond its immediate tactical impact on submarine warfare. It represents a case study in how incremental technological improvements, when properly integrated into operational doctrine and supported by adequate training, and can fundamentally alter combat dynamics, even when the underlying technology is not revolutionary. The Hedgehog was not a guided weapon or electronic marvel. It was a relatively simple mechanical device, a spigot mortar adapted for naval use, firing unguided projectiles that sank through water and detonated on contact. Yet this straightforward concept, when combined with improved sonar systems and better tactical training, achieved effectiveness that far exceeded more sophisticated weapons systems. The development process also illustrated the importance of persistence in the face of early failure. Initial Hedgehog deployments achieved disappointing results that might have justified abandoning the weapon entirely. Success rates barely exceeded those of depth charges. Crews distrusted the system, technical problems plagued operations. A less determined organization than the Royal Navy might have concluded, the weapon was fundamentally flawed and returned to established methods. Instead, British leadership analyzed the problems systematically, identified that most difficulties stemmed from inadequate training and poor integration with sonar systems, rather than inherent design flaws, and invested resources in comprehensive crew education programs that transformed performance. The American adoption of Hedgehog through reverse Lend-Lease demonstrated Allied cooperation in military technology development. Britain, which had spent considerable resources developing the weapon, freely shared the design with American forces. The United States produced its own variants and improvements, including the mousetrap system for smaller patrol craft that could not accommodate full Hedgehog launchers. This collaborative approach, where each ally contributed their strengths to common defense challenges, contrasted sharply with German and Japanese practices, where inter-service rivalry and institutional jealousy often prevented effective cooperation. The tactical implications of forward-firing anti-submarine weapons influenced naval doctrine well beyond World War II. The principle that weapons should be employed while maintaining sensor contact with the target, rather than after losing contact, became fundamental to modern anti-submarine warfare. Post-war developments, including the British Squid and Limbo mortar systems, and eventually acoustic homing torpedoes like the American Mark 46, all embodied this same concept: maintain contact, attack, while the target remains under observation, eliminate the blind time that allows evasion. For German naval theorists reflecting after the war, Hedgehog represented one element in a comprehensive Allied technological and tactical response that German forces could not counter given their resource constraints and strategic circumstances. The weapon did not single-handedly defeat the U-boat threat. Rather, it formed part of an integrated system that included improved radar for surface detection, high-frequency direction finding for radio intercept, escort carriers providing air cover over convoys, increasingly sophisticated sonar systems, and the comprehensive breaking of German naval Enigma codes that allowed Allied forces to route convoys around submarine concentrations or position hunter-killer groups to intercept U-boats, whose locations and intentions known in advance. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded Germany's submarine force and briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state in the war's final days, spent years after the war analyzing why his U-boats had failed to achieve the strategic results he believed possible. He correctly identified Allied code-breaking as a critical factor. German submarines were sailing into traps because their operational orders were being read by the enemy. He noted the impact of escort carriers in closing the mid-Atlantic air gap where submarines had previously operated beyond land-based aircraft range. He acknowledged that improved Allied sonar and weapons systems made submarine operations increasingly costly. But Dönitz never fully accepted that the fundamental equation had shifted irreversibly against submarines once Allied industrial capacity, technological development, and tactical innovation reached full effectiveness. He continued to believe that different tactics, better training, or improved German submarine designs might have altered outcomes. This represented a common pattern among German military leaders, acknowledging specific Allied advantages, while refusing to accept that the cumulative effect of those advantages, combined with Germany's deteriorating strategic position and resource base, made defeat inevitable, regardless of tactical adjustments. The human cost of this failure to accept reality manifested in the casualty figures. U-boat crews continued sailing on patrols through the final weeks of the war when any strategic benefit from their operations had long since evaporated. Submarines that could have remained in port, preserving their crews' lives for Germany's eventual reconstruction, instead departed on missions that achieved nothing beyond adding more names to the casualty lists. The dedication and courage of these men deserves respect. But their sacrifice was wasted by leadership that could not accept what the evidence clearly demonstrated. Return now to that moment on May 29, 1944, when U-549 sank beneath the North Atlantic with all hands lost. Kapitänleutnant Detlev Krankenhagen commanded a modern submarine crewed by trained sailors. He understood anti-submarine warfare tactics that German forces had refined through 4 years of brutal experience. He executed the evasion procedures that doctrine prescribed: dive deep, go silent, wait for the blind spot, maneuver when the escort passes overhead. Every decision he made was correct according to the knowledge available to him. It was not enough. The tactical environment had changed in ways German commanders understood imperfectly, or not at all. The escort maintained sonar contact at depths German doctrine considered safe. The attack came from ahead rather than from directly overhead. The projectiles arrived in seconds rather than the half-minute that depth charges required. When they struck, death followed instantaneously, with no opportunity for damage control, no possibility of survival, no chance to surface and abandon ship. This is the profound irony at the heart of the Hedgehog story. German U-boat crews were not defeated because they lacked courage or skill. They lost because the tactical paradigm within which their courage and skill operated had been fundamentally altered by technological and doctrinal changes they could neither predict nor counter. The knowledge that had previously kept them alive exploit the blind spot, maneuver during descent time, survive through structural strength and evasion became obsolete, transformed from survival wisdom to lethal misconception. The psychological dimension distinguishes this from a simple story of technological advancement. German submariners did not face overwhelming force that crushed them through sheer material superiority, though Allied numerical advantages were certainly real. Instead, they confronted a situation where the assumptions underlying their tactical doctrine had been invalidated. They were practicing tactics designed for an operational environment that no longer existed, unaware that the rules had changed until the moment those new rules killed them. This pattern of military forces continuing to employ tactics that worked previously while remaining unaware. Those tactics have been countered appears repeatedly throughout military history. It explains why cavalry charges persisted into the era of machine guns. It illuminates why fortress cities fell to artillery that could breach walls previously considered impregnable. It clarifies why battleships became obsolete when aircraft carriers demonstrated the ability to strike from beyond visual range. In each case, the fundamental tactical environment shifted in ways that made previous doctrine not merely less effective, but actively dangerous. The Hedgehog weapon system achieved strategic impact disproportionate to its mechanical simplicity because it attacked the core assumptions of German anti-submarine evasion doctrine. By eliminating the blind spot, compressing reaction time, and requiring only a single contact hit to achieve a kill, it removed every margin that German tactical skill had exploited. A U-boat commander could execute perfect evasion maneuvers according to doctrine and still die because that doctrine no longer applied to the weapons being employed against him. For the 28,000 German submariners who died during World War II, many in the war's final 18 months when Hedgehog and similar improved anti-submarine systems achieved widespread deployment, this represented a tragedy that extended beyond the simple horror of death in combat. These men died partly because their leadership could not, or would not, accept that the tactical balance had shifted irreversibly. They died because German naval intelligence gathered information too slowly, and German training doctrine adapted too gradually to the changing operational environment. They died because the institutional machinery of the Kriegsmarine continued dispatching submarines on missions whose strategic value had evaporated, while their costs in lives mounted catastrophically. The Hedgehog's success rate 1 kill for every 5 attacks by war's end, compared to 1 kill for every 60 depth charge attacks, quantifies this transformation in mathematical terms. But statistics cannot capture what it meant experientially for submarine crews who found themselves under attack by weapons they did not fully understand, weapons that violated their tactical assumptions about how anti-submarine combat functioned. That experience of discovering that your hard-won knowledge has become obsolete, that your survival techniques no longer work, that death can arrive without warning or opportunity for response, represents the ultimate cost of truth colliding with belief. The morning of May 29, 1944, began with Kapitänleutnant Krankenhagen believing his skill and his crew's discipline could bring them safely home. 4.5 minutes after USS Elmore's second Hedgehog salvo entered the water, U-549 ceased to exist. Between those two moments lies everything this story means, the gap between what we believe and what is true, measured in the lives of men who never learned the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.